So talking about history of IBM today, when when you've been in business as long as IBM has, you can't just start with the IBM PC, run through that and say we're done. There's a lot more things that have happened over the time that IBM got started. So I'm going to cover some of it, but not all of it. So if your favorite machine isn't mentioned, sorry, I just cut them out because. So Herman Hollerith, probably a name best known for a particular product, but probably the man himself wasn't probably very well known. He was kind of a quiet person. He wasn't really too interested in fame. He was more interested in solving a problem. Typical engineer. In 1884, he developed a mechanism that used an electrical connection to increment a counter and record a piece of information. He provided these tabulators under contract to the U.S. Census office, which used them to record the census in the 1890. This is a photo of an operator that is punching holes in these cards, and the tray next to her is where they put the results so that they can then tabulate them later. Hollerith methods allowed the census to be completed in 6 years, and the last one in the 1880s took 8 to do it by hand. And the cards look something like this, and you'll notice that if you've seen these before, you'll recognize them. However, Hollerith, realized that his tabulating company wasn't going to survive because there was 10 years between census, and he didn't have the money in order to go forward. I mean, they had the tabulators, so they weren't going to buy one for the next census unless they needed more of them. But that wasn't going to be enough revenue to keep him going for 10 years. So he realized that he couldn't make, just doing the tabulating business, he could not make a living doing that. So he sold his business to Charles R. Flint. Charles Flint picked it up, and he had a few ideas of what to do with it. And what he decided to do with it is he had 3 other companies besides the tabulating company. One of them made scales. One of them had a time recording machine. There was also a manufacturing company that would do different kinds of manufacturing. So he thought all of those together would make a great company, and so he amalgamated those 4 companies. Amalgamated means you merge all the stocks together and form a 5th company, and that was called Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTRC, and he did that in 1911. But then he needed someone to manage it. Well, as it turns out, right about 1914, Thomas Watson was fired from NCR by the CEO, Patterson. Anyway, Watson was hired in 1914 as the general manager of CTRC. And Watson was made president 11 months later. Why? He doubled the sales in less than 11 months. And so Flint was impressed and said, okay, I'm going to just have you run the company. Now, in 1924, Watson saw that the business could grow beyond the U.S. And if he wanted to be able to have the business grow, he needed to open markets in other areas of the world. So to make the name more conducive to an international business flavor, he renamed it to International Business Machines. And they ended up leasing their tabulating equipment to almost 100% of the businesses in the U.S., about 90% actually. So they had saturated their market, and that's probably part of the reason they were needing to move elsewhere to get more customers. So by the time that Thomas Watson passed away in 1956, IBM had grown to $895 million in revenues annual, and they had 72,500 employees, at the start being for Thomas J. Watson Jr. He had become president of IBM in 1952, taking over that role from his father, who continued on as CEO and chairman of the board until his death. Shortly after his father's death, Jr. was appointed CEO of IBM. So he quickly moved IBM into the computer business, which his father had rejected time and time again. Didn't want to get into it, didn't think it would. The famous quote was, there's only need in the world for 4 of these machines, maybe. Watson Jr. had different ideas, and so he started moving the business into computers. And he started that even while his father was still there. And that's part of the reason why the company started growing. And it grew really fast at an incredible rate almost. During the entire reign of the leadership of Thomas Watson Jr., and that was from 1952 to until he retired in 1971. IBM gained market share and growth at 30% a year. That's horrendous. Anybody that could do that kind of business today, it would be amazing. Not likely, but it would be amazing. He is best known for keeping a famous project called the System 360 going, even though it was late, it was over budget, and they could not seem to manage it into place. It was very difficult to do, and so it turned out that the System 360, it was a good bet because that became their most successful product until the launch of the IBM PC. But the 360 was a line of computer systems. They introduced it in April of 1964. They began shipping units to customers in 1965 all the way up to 1978 when it was finally discontinued. They introduced their next generation machine called the 370 on June 30th, 1970. The System 370 underwent many architectural changes over its lifespan as well. And it went for 20 years, a lot longer than the 360 did. So being able to interchange things out, make them faster, make them bigger, was a plus. And so these basic modular machines were able to grow with the times and the needs of their customers. Frank Cary stepped in January of 1973. He was named CEO and chairman of the board of IBM. He had a vision. He saw that the personal computer or the microcomputer was a threat to IBM. He saw it as a threat to their mainframe business. And so he wanted to get in on that action before it took their mainframe business out because he knew it would. He formed a special small unit, dedicated group, to spearhead the entry systems division, and he pushed it all the way down to Boca Raton, Florida, so it was totally away from all of the IBM bureaucracy. So he appointed William C. Lowe. A lot of people call Esteridge the father of the IBM PC, but I don't think so. I think it was, if you look at the ideas behind it, what went into it, how it was put together, those were all Lowe's ideas, not Esteridge's. So I would say he was really the father of the IBM PC and not Esteridge. But anyway, that's just my opinion. The entry-level systems division was what he took on in 1978. So he determined that IBM was not going to be able to build this thing internally. It just wasn't going to work. They couldn't build a personal computer that's going to be profitable in the timely manner that CEO Cary was giving him. So he suggested that they buy a company that had personal computing experience, already had a market up and running, they already had customers, they already had manufacturing, and he suggested they go out and buy Atari. However, that didn't really fit what CEO Cary was trying to do. He was looking to get away from this monolithic, take forever culture to develop something, because he saw the second phase of the threat, which was being hit by competitors in new areas that IBM was unaware of. And so they wouldn't be able to turn, and it's hard to move an elephant and turn it fast enough to be able to intercept a threat that's coming in really fast at you. And so he wanted to encourage small, autonomous, independent business units in order to run lean, run fast, get things done quicker. Maybe they didn't work as well, but you had time to iron those kinds of things out as you went along. Lowe said, okay, since I have this corporate waiver, I'm free of all the bureaucratic overhead. Okay, I'll hire a small 12-person unit and we'll get to work. So within a couple of years, they had a working prototype, sort of. It was kind of buggy, but it worked by August of 1980. And that was enough that Lowe could see, and he could put his hands on it, and he could start to construct a business plan around marketing the product. They knew what they wanted to do with it, but based on the parts and everything that they were going to be bringing in, they had to know what they could do. So his business plan was to streamline the development process entirely so that they could build this quicker, be able to modify it quicker, and get software on it quicker. So he wanted an open architecture which allowed them to pull pieces off the shelf that IBM didn't have to go out and invent. And then he wanted it to be non-proprietary so that it was stuff that would work interchangeably. So when they put it in the machine, that each piece would work with its neighbor, right? So they did that with both the components and the software. And he didn't want IBM to be messing with the retail part of this at all. All of those positions that he stated, every single one of them was contrary to IBM's go-to-business strategy at the time. CEO Cary apparently liked the plan because he approved it to move forward. They hired Donald Esteridge out of the System 1 division. He had been working on that project, and they moved him over here because he had experience with the personal computers. He had an Apple at home. This is one of the later boards for the IBM PC. This is not the original. So if you're looking at going, wow, there's too much memory on there for 64, you're right. This is a later board. So they quickly had a design from the standard components, and they outsourced the operating system from Microsoft. That's a story of its own. But one of the weird things that IBM allowed Microsoft to do was to retain ownership of MS-DOS. And not only to retain ownership, but to collect royalties on every copy sold. And those two things also were at odds with the way IBM went to business. There's no way the old IBM would ever have signed up for anything like that. But later on, this would come back and bite IBM really hard. But they didn't know that at the time. The product was launched in August of 1981, and it did quite well. This was the IBM Model 5150, and so it was introduced at a price of $1565, and IBM totally underestimated the market. The demand for the product was 800% above what they had forecasted. A good problem to have, but that meant a lot of customers were waiting on machines for a while until the inventory caught up. IBM was selling 40,000 of those machines every month. That's huge. Not only that, but software developers were jumping on in droves. But by the end of the first year, they had over 753 programs that they could sell for it. Specs of the machine was that it was based on an Intel 8088 CPU, 64 kilobytes of memory, and 83 key keyboard was included. I don't believe the monochrome display was included. I think that was an option. They didn't offer a color monitor initially. That came about when they had the CGA graphics card and the EGA graphics card available. But it did have 5 internal ISA slots. There were 2 options. You could have either 1 floppy drive or 2, nothing else. They were 160 kilobyte, 5.25-inch disk drives. And it came with PC-DOS 1.0. The next version up was the PCXT, and that was to provide more storage. That was the 5160. That was introduced March 1983. Similar specs, except for it had 128 kilobytes of base RAM. And you could choose from a 10 or a 20 megabyte hard drive. The base price was $5,000 for the machine. Hard drives were expensive. All of the sales for the PC and the PCXT were going into the enterprise. They were going into companies and being placed on desktops for people to use. IBM felt that there was really need for a home computer. So they wanted to develop something that was inexpensive for the home in hopes that people would buy them. So they offered this one at $699 for a 64 kilobyte RAM version. And they also offered one at $1,269 for 128 kilobyte of RAM with a 340 kilobyte 5.25-inch floppy drive. And so the machine initially had it had some enthusiasm, but as soon as people started to look at the keyboard and tried to use it, they didn't like it. They didn't like the keyboard at all. The chiclet keyboard was mush, didn't have any function keys, as I remember, and a lot of the programs back then needed function keys, and yeah, it just wasn't going to work. Plus, it was in a market where the IBM PC was too small for the enterprise, so they didn't want it, and it was too expensive for the home user, so they didn't want it. So who was going to buy it? Yeah, the next year it was discontinued, and it's almost to the day, almost a year to the day it was released. IBM released the 5170. This was in August, a little bit later in 1984. This was designed to offer their business customers more, and it was priced between $4,000 and $6,000. It was spec'd with an Intel 8286 CPU. Came with a base RAM of 256 kilobyte RAM. You could expand it to 16 meg. You had an optional coprocessor you could buy for it, and it came with a 20 megabyte hard drive. You could buy it without it, and we'll talk about that. You could also put 2 drives in it, and they were 1.2 megabyte, 5¼ inch floppy drives. There was some problems with customers, if you're wondering, there was some problems with customers using the older style diskettes in this drive. Yeah, it didn't work out so well. Yeah, the wear leveling on that other surface was, those drive, that was a bad idea. If somebody stuck a 160 kilobyte disk in there, or even a 360 in there. It had CGA or EGA graphics, an 84 key keyboard, and PC DOS 3.0. It had a lot of different models, and it shipped with computer memories, hard drives, which were problematic. They crashed. They were very unreliable. A lot of the machines went back into the service centers for repair, and IBM replaced the hard drives eventually. I don't know what unit they went with, but they eventually dropped computer memories to get rid of the problem. The other problem the machine had was it would fail to start if it had a minimum load. If it didn't meet the minimum load of the switching power supply, it would not come on. You had to have 7 amps on the plus 5 volt and 2.5 amps on the 12 volt rail in order for the power supply to switch on, which would just be enough for the power supply to sense the hard drive. Now, if you didn't buy it with a hard drive, it wasn't going to start. So IBM solved that problem. If you bought it without a hard drive, they would stick a resistor pack into the drive connector, into the power connector. Between the time of the AT's launch in 1984 and 1987, the clone manufacturers had figured out how to release a BIOS that was 100% compatible with IBM's BIOS without using any of their code. I think part of the problem was IBM made the mistake of publishing their BIOS in their technical reference manuals. You could get a technical reference manual, and in the back was a complete paper listing of their BIOS, which would not be useful to someone that, unless they were pirating the BIOS, but these people wanted a legal one, but it did show them where all the API hooks were in the BIOS, and then they could go off and write the code themselves that would perform those operations. It made reverse engineering a lot easier. And the first people to do it was Compaq. And so they were able to sell clones, and they did 2 things. They undercut IBM's price, and they arrived in market with new machines before IBM did, because they didn't have the overhead to get approval. And the second shoe that dropped was Phoenix. Phoenix independently went off and developed their own BIOS. Only instead of hoarding it to themselves, they licensed it to anybody that wanted it. They had a perfectly legal copy of the BIOS that was 100% compatible. I think in the initial, as I recall with the Phoenix BIOS, there was some initial teething problems, but they were quickly ironed out. So IBM wanted to put, the long and the short of it, IBM wanted to do something to combat that. They wanted to put a stop to it. So they started working on the PS2, and they had a couple of models, the 90 and 95. There was a number of different numbers or whatever underneath of those that you could get different components for. They had CPUs that were 8086 based, they had 8286, they had 8386SX, 8386DX. They even had one that had a specially licensed version of the IBM, of the Intel chip, the 386. It was basically a specially cut one of the DX called the SLC, which had some additional functionality in it that IBM wanted. It had its own architecture for the bus called microchannel, or microchannel architecture. So that means that all the cars that you bought for your PC and your XT and your Compaq, you threw them away if you wanted to go to this machine. So that could have been thousands of dollars, right, to be able to move to this machine. It was priced at $1,695 and went up to $10,995. I used to call it the IBM's Empire Strikes Back PC because it was really meant to thwart the clones. Unfortunately, they let the lawyers in on it, and they locked down everything that they could, which basically made a lot of people angry. But it did offer a couple of things that became standards, and one of them was the SIM RAM modules. So they were a lot less capable than the ones, of course, we have today. But the joke was that this machine's purpose was to make IBM obsolete. But it was discontinued in July of 1995. On May 11th, 1997, an IBM computer called Deep Blue beat the world chess champion at the time, Kasparov, after a 6-game match. And IBM won 2 games, Kasparov won 1, the other 3 were a draw. And so, so he lost to Deep Blue. Well, that was the first time a human had ever been beaten by a computer. And so along that same time frame, in 2004, IBM's business had changed. And so IBM finally threw up their hands in 2004 and said, we need to sell this. And so they sold it in 2005 to Lenovo. IBM wanted to get out of they had a managed service business where they managed customers' infrastructure for them. So they decided to break that business off. And in November 2021, they did just that. They separated the managed infrastructure, they call it Managed Infrastructure Services, or MIS, business to Kyndryl. And Kyndryl is a IBM-owned company, so they're under their own P&L statement. And IBM is now freed from that business, and so their bottom line doesn't get tainted with anything that's happening from Kyndryl. So they can go off and do whatever they want based on what they're doing. And that is where things lie today with IBM. So, and with that, I did not cover everything in IBM. They have so many patents, it would take forever to go through every invention that IBM has ever made. It's hard to imagine the impact of one company on the world's processors. A machine that you're running, if you're running a PC, still has a lot of the architecture that IBM designed into it. It's still open, and that is the key cornerstone that IBM used to make it successful. The product is successful, but IBM's control over it is gone. And that's probably a good thing, to be honest. Anyway, that's all I had for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Hope to see you all again soon. Bye for now.